All right, so hello and welcome to today's roundtable on addressing individual animal interests within the zoo context. My name is Anne Clay, and I am a PhD candidate in environmental science and public policy at George Mason University in the United States. I'm hosting this event together with the help of my co-moderator, Pablo Serra Palau, and facilitated by the Global Research Network's think tank program on animals and biodiversity. We are thrilled to welcome audience members today and strongly encourage you to apply for membership if you are interested in joining an engaging platform that facilitates opportunities to exchange with like-minded scholars on similar issues. I would like to open this roundtable by thanking the amazing speakers who have graciously accepted our invitation to discuss animal interests in zoos. Today, we are joined by a diverse panel of experts in animal welfare, ethology, ethics, and social sciences, whose insights will allow us to examine the role of the zoo animal individual from different angles, from how to scientifically address animal interests to human perceptions of animal subjective experiences. The objective of this roundtable is to explore the role of the individual zoo animal in modern zoos, which also fulfill priorities in research, conservation, education, and entertainment. Through these discussions, we would like to determine if and how zoos can fulfill their ethical obligations towards the animals in their care, giving them a life worth living while maintaining these other priorities in an artificial context. So I will now give the floor to Pablo, who will have the honor of introducing our speakers.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in this wonderful roundtable. As Anne said in her inspiring introduction, my name is Pablo Serra Palau. I'm a PhD candidate in law at the University of Murcia in the southeast of Spain, where I conduct my research on the emerging legal paradigm of Earth system law. I'm pretty sure that I will learn a lot today from our invited speakers, whom I thank once again for accepting our invitation and to share their knowledge and expertise with us. I regrettably have to inform you that Silvina Peseta, Dr. Silvina Peseta, won't be with us today due to personal circumstances. In my opinion, her approach from the legal sphere and also from Latin America would have been really, really enlightening, would have like an interdisciplinary value to the conversation, but she won't be with us today. And that made me think that we should start thinking about organizing a second edition of this roundtable just to have the opportunity to listen to her work. And as Anne also said in her introduction, it is a great pleasure to me co-moderating this roundtable together with her. I have to say that she has done all the hard work. In organizing this event, I'm playing more of a supporting role here. And I say this because I don't want to take any credit for the success of today's event. It belongs only and only to Anne, to the invited speakers, and also, of course, to the GRN team. I should also thank our colleagues of the Animals and Biodiversity think tank program, and a special thanks goes to Marine Lercier and also for Tiamat Guarda, who will be helping us today with the YouTube live stream and also with the Zoom chat, respectively. And I know that time flies and we have 1 hour and a half more or less, but I have to make a quick comment about the structure of the roundtable before. First, our 4 brilliant speakers will have like from 12 to 15 minutes to comment and to share their insights about this topic. Then we will open the floor for discussion. If you have any questions during the presentations, please write them down, whether in the Zoom chat or in the YouTube chat. And finally, if you don't know how to pose your question in English, I strongly encourage you to write it down, whether either in French or in Spanish, which are the languages that Anne and I speak, and we will gladly translate it into English because in the end, we don't want language to be an impediment to share your questions with the rest of us. So let's move on to introduce our first excellent speaker and colleague, Anne Clay. Anne received a bachelor's and a master's degree in biology and society from Arizona State University. Her PhD research, as we will see, focuses on a comparative study on zoos in the United States, South Korea, and France. And today she will discuss the individual consideration of animals in the context of zoological parks. And thanks again for all your effort in making this happen. And now the floor is yours, and the clock is ticking. Thanks.
So thank you, Pablo, for that very nice introduction. Today, I'll be presenting Individuals Matter, my research on zoos, conservation, and animal welfare. So Individuals Matter is the first principle of compassionate conservation, which is a movement advocating empathy for individuals as central to conservation decision-making. Some scholars argue that the implications of compassionate conservation could help zoos face trade-offs that occur when caring for individual animals and putting conservation goals into practice. An infamous example of such a trade-off is when the Copenhagen Zoo euthanized Marius, a young healthy giraffe, because he was a surplus animal whose genes were sufficiently represented in zoos across the European Union. In contrast, a dolphin named Jedur made South Korea's national headlines when the Seoul Zoo reintroduced him back into Korean waters after it was discovered he had been illegally captured 4 years prior. Both cases contributed to widespread debates on the ethics of captivity. The stories of Marius and Jedur reflect two drastically different approaches that illustrate how modern zoos value individual animals when focusing their efforts on conservation priorities. The focus of my research examines whether zoos recognize the intrinsic value of wild individuals without reducing this value according to their status as members of collectives, such as species or ecosystems. To do this, I explored 3 case studies that included zoos in the United States, in France, and in South Korea, where I interviewed experts from the zoo, conservation, and animal rights fields. Today, I will present quotes from interviews I conducted related to modern zoos, held up by the 5 pillars of entertainment, education, research, conservation, and animal welfare. Animal welfare, animal rights, and conservation each represent distinct ethical views. Animal welfare prioritizes the quality of life of individual animals. Animal rights takes this concept further by ascribing the moral equivalent of personhood to individual animals. And then finally, conservation gives moral precedence to ecosystems and endangered species. My interviews revealed 2 fundamentally opposing discourses that present distinct perceptions of the zoo animal individual. In zoos, whether or not individuals matter is often dismissed by a justificatory discourse, which justifies captivity and other invasive actions on animals as necessary for conservation. In this case, providing good welfare becomes a way to manage the lives of captive animals as reproductive components, who also act as ambassadors, representing collective species in the wild. In contrast, the abolitionist discourse displayed by anti-zoo animal rights advocates frames individuals as sentient persons with intrinsic rights to life, liberty, and bodily integrity. So I argue that interactions between these discourses reveal ethical dilemmas that threaten the life, liberty, and bodily integrity of individual animals. These dilemmas cause zoo personnel to find solutions that increasingly center on individual animal interests and autonomy. So zoos present individuals as reproductive components of a genetic patrimony. As this director told me, we could conserve without being concerned by the way we conserve. As long as the animals reproduce, we have achieved the conservation mission. Individuals who don't meet zoo breeding and exhibition requirements can be eliminated or prevented from reproducing. In this case, to fulfill conservation goals, providing good welfare simply ensures that the reproductive components of these lineages stay biologically functional enough to produce other individuals. These decisions imposed on animals are a result of trying to recreate natural conditions in an artificial environment. For example, letting animals express their full reproductive behavior could help maintain harmony in a group, but also result in several surplus individuals. Having too many individuals can lead to violent conflicts. The welfare of the group becomes dependent on removing certain animals at sexual maturity. As this director expresses to me, well, these are part of the things that are complicated to manage because you are at odds with your values. It's more than a compromise. Here you're in a crisis. Zoo conservation priorities focused on populations and species clash with anti-zoos that tend to exclusively focus on individuals. As mentioned by this activist I spoke with, what concerns us are individuals. That's where we seem to have trouble finding an understanding with zoos. Does she suffer or not? For this veterinarian, however, eliminating individual animal suffering takes precedence over conservation-oriented priorities. Conservation is politics, so in the end, it's hollow. Welfare is real. When I have a sick animal, I could care less if he is part of some population for conservation. All I want is for him to be well. Individual zoo animals also act as ambassadors to their wild counterparts. They represent species and ecosystems other than themselves. Bringing people in contact with live animals is expected to inspire them to care for the environment. As this zoo educator emphasizes to me, nothing beats the direct visual contact with an animal in the flesh. Individuals are therefore used instrumentally to help bring awareness to collectives and indirectly benefit conservation. This zoo director points out that all of these animals, in being ambassadors to their counterparts, are being sacrificed for conservation. For these animals who are sacrificing themselves, it is our responsibility to make sure they live with the best welfare possible. Yet, anti-zoos perceive animal welfare practices as unable to provide for wild animal interests. The notion of animal welfare has always been put forward by enterprises or institutes that exploit animals. It's not a notion where we recognize ourselves. For us, the notion of liberty is fundamental, and notably for wild animals. Nevertheless, the perspectives of animal rights advocates, along with a societal awareness in the public regarding the animal condition, directly influence zoo employees and practices. This zoo director tells me, we have an individualization of zoo animals, like in animal rights, that asks that animals be considered as individuals. He then goes on to reflect that this increasing awareness of animal consciousness led me to question myself regarding the animals that we have in captivity. And since I can't do anything other than to keep them here, I tell myself I will do everything to improve their quality of life. Zoo personnel seek to solve these dilemmas by empowering animals in other ways. A growing awareness of animal subjective experiences has become fundamental to the structures aiming to ensure good welfare to zoo animals. This can be seen in the enrichment and positive reinforcement training practices that allow the animal to have more choice and control over his environment, including the power to stay in an interior or exterior enclosure, to choose his own food, to have a varied environment with several hiding spots, to have the possibility to interact with another conspecific, or to participate in training. As this veterinarian tells me, welfare is to give the animal choice and control over his environment. So stop controlling him and make sure that he is in control. The central justification zoos provide for captivity is the fact that we live in a non-ideal world with a looming extinction crisis threatening our biodiversity. Zoos believe in their potential to bring awareness to this by connecting people to individual animals and providing positive welfare that prioritizes the individual interests of each zoo animal. As this educator states, this is the whole paradox of working in a zoo. We are not necessarily for having animals in captivity. In an ideal world, we don't exist. So in conclusion, for conservation, zoos justify practices that reduce individuals to their status as members of collectives, from comprising genetic lineages to representing a species. Framing individuals in these ways reveals dilemmas for zoo professionals who, also influenced by the abolitionist discourse of anti-zoo organizations, and knowledge regarding the animal condition, are increasingly focused on fulfilling the interests of individual zoo animals in an environment where captivity threatens their life, liberty, and bodily integrity. But thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your revealing insights and reflections from your comparative study, from your doctoral research. It is true that certainly it's a topic with that we have. It reflects conflicts, historical conflict in applied ethics between alleged incompatible positions between perspectives, holist perspectives, individualist perspectives. So thank you so much for these valuable insights. And next, we are also pleased to have Dr. Amelie Roman with us. Dr. Roman has a PhD in biology and animal behavior at the French National Research Institute in Strasbourg. She has worked in the field with great apes in Gabon and Congo for 2 years. She also started a company named Congo 5 years ago to help zoos and other institutions around France and Europe to improve animal welfare by implementing science-based decisions. In her presentation, she will shed light on how zoos can handle animal welfare and conservation missions at the same time. So, Dr. Roman, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we are all ears. You may share the screen now.
So thank you. And today I will discuss with you if zoo can manage animal welfare without compromising their conservation missions and vice versa. So as I said, the roles of modern zoo are about conservation, research, education, but also entertainment for visitors. And when I'm talking about conservation, it's a broader approach that includes species populations, but also habitats and also human behavior changes and community engagement. And one thing that is essential also for zoos is, of course, animal welfare. And since several years now, there is more and more questions about ethics and how we can, is it right to keep animals in captivity? And if yes, in which condition? So Anne start to give us some insight about it, and it's still many questions that I will try to address also today. So just a quick definition about ethics. It's really something that is a human-centered approach based on what you think is acceptable. And for instance, on this picture, some of you might think that these situations are acceptable or they are not. It depends. Some of situation could be depending of the context, and your opinion will depend of your personality, your experience, culture, your religion, or your education. So really something about our feelings. When we are talking about animal welfare, we are on an animal-centered approach, and our role is to see if animals can actually have a good welfare in the situation, whatever our opinion about the situation. So it doesn't matter if you agree or not to keep animals in that way. The question is, could these animals can have a good welfare in this situation? So welfare is independent of ethical consideration, and it does not, your ethical consideration does not change the need of animals in zoos or in other settings. So to come back to zoos conservation and roles, so many zoos have participated to ex situ population conservation, which have several aims to sensibilize people on in situ conservation, but also animals in zoo might be population reservoir in some cases, and it also can happen that animals from zoo can be used for reinforcement population, even if it's pretty unusual. So how the zoo choose to have a healthy captive population. So they are looking for genetic diversity, and they also are looking for behavioral diversity, which means that the goal is to avoid that animals are too much adapted to captivity, and especially as they try to maintain characteristic behaviors of the species that are in these programs. So behavioral diversity actually depends on the activities that are available for the animals. So you can see in zoo settings some new behaviors that can be due to human interaction or lack of stimulation, or also environment or exhibits. So for instance, with these lemurs close to the water. But it's important when you are thinking and looking about welfare to understand what actually are the behaviors that animals can do in their environment. If you look at this gorilla on this concrete floor with a waterfall close to him, with no vegetation, with no other gorilla in the same area, what actually are the behavioral possibility for him? Can we ensure welfare of this animal in this kind of settings? And gorillas are, as all primates, spend most of their time to forage in the wild, and so they really are always looking and for food. And so if you look at these pictures, these two pictures actually have been taken in Africa, but this one on the right is from Dublin Zoo. So you can see that you can also, at least at some point, recreate condition where the animals can express actually their behavior repertory, and it's important for their welfare. So this this kind of behavioral diversity will help to fulfill the individual needs, but will also help you with the educational message that you want to give to the visitors. It will help to have a healthy captive population with animals in good shape, and also help to be faced with the ethical responsibility and treat animals with respect and fulfill their needs. So when acting to an individual level, actually you are acting also at a global level. And so animal welfare is really a condition for conservation actions in zoos. So most of the time, actually the individual needs are in the same direction than the population needs in zoos. But sometimes it might happen that individual needs do not meet population needs, and in that situation, what would be the priority and of which justification? And it's a difficult question to address, and I will present just a few examples to discuss about it. The first thing is, as Anne said, most of the species presented in zoos are social species. that live in complex social organization, which means that it's not only being with conspecifics that are important for animals, but also the relationship with their conspecific. And in that case, if you are removing actually only one animal on the group, you can affect the whole group. You can have impact of other individuals. So, for instance, in this mandrill group, you can see that the female one and the female two have not the same type of connection with other individuals from the group. So if you are removing the female one or the female two, it will be different impact on your group. So it's important to try for those to not only looking at the genetics or at age of your individuals when you are when you organize transfer of your animals, but have a more global picture before to choose. So another complex choice is, I told you about population program. This year we have more than 400 programs in ESA Zoo, but of course we have also resources limited in between zoos, resources in terms of space, of staff, of money, on effort also. So it will conduct to challenges about reproductive and demographic, how you can manage if you have enough individuals in your population. So this means that your population has to be slowed down or stopped. Not all your animals will be allowed to breed. And for some species also, we will have some problems with sex ratio between male and female. So how zoos can control their population? So as said, as many species are social, you cannot just keep individual alone, or you can do it, but you will have a question about his welfare. So you can manage to have some same-sex group to not breed your animals. You can do contraception, and also you can do breed and cut strategy. I will come back to it in a minute. So what we know already so far, it's depending of the species. We have some species that are really cooperative, and the care of the young are really at the core of their behavior. So, for instance, for the marmoset groups, so it's for them it will be really important to have this possibility to breed, because they are living in familial groups, and it's only stable or at least a more stable kind of group. For some other species, we know that same-sex group doesn't work. It might be the case for adult equids and especially males. And in other species, we do have other problematic, because if some females are not breeding for several seasons, actually it leads to sterility. So they can't breed anymore. So the welfare of your individual will, the impact will vary depending of your individual, depending of the biology of your species. So it's difficult to find a way that will be convenient for every species. So for some species, the ESA brings a breed and cult strategy, which means that you will euthanize healthy animals because they are not useful for the genetic of your captive population. It has been the case, for instance, for the Red River hog, which are in EEP and that are in the EUCN Red List. So if you are thinking about the welfare perspective, so it was for these two little ones, actually there is no question about welfare, because when animals are dead, there is no risk for them about how they will cope with their environment. So the welfare is not a question for the animal concerned, but it could be for the rest of the group, depending of how it happened. But it raises question from ethical perspective. So how should we consider that it's acceptable to end the life of animals that have no direct value for us? And it's something that we'll, I think, discuss it deeper later, but it's a difficult question to address. And my last example is about geriatric animals. We have in captivity for most of the species a lifespan that increase, but what about the quality of life? We can have animals which will not reproduce anymore, animals that can have health problem. And so in that case, it can lead also to compromise welfare for themselves, but also have an impact for the more global population, because for instance, for some other groups, the transfer of animals cannot be effective because of animals that are still in life. So for those responsibility for welfare, it's our responsibility to offer them the best quality of life. And we know, for instance, that for felids, using feeding pole will not increase the lifespan, but will decrease the health problems. So it should be something that happen systematically for felids. And for ethical point of view, again, we can think about euthanasia. Sometimes it's in the interest of the animals, but sometimes it might be also for the population management. So how we can decide on which criteria and on which justification. So to conclude, we will have more and more population management and animal welfare that involve ethical consideration. We do not have easy response. We do not have one solution that we fit for all situations. So we really have to think about what we want to do for which objectives, and how we are convinced if we are doing either the right response or not. In any case, animal welfare is essential for the population, but for conservation, I think it's really important that zoo really work on it with in-situ projects and carefully planning for population management to help with this difficult decision. We also must take decision on scientific evidence, and not just saying that, oh, it's poor welfare or it's good welfare or we will succeed, but really have a research approach and methodology when we are trying to manage our animals, and working together, not only in zoos, but also with external people to have a big view of the pictures. And we have to also start to thinking about communication with general public of the ethic dilemma, because as Han say, for the Marius case, for instance, it has been a lot of comments, of public comments. So how zoo will handle with this communication about their decisions? And I think it's something will become more and more important in the next years. So thanks for your attention, and we'll be glad to discuss it in deeper with you later.
Dr. Roman, thank you so much. Really, it was a really inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. And you, as expected, you shed light on the complexity of dealing with conservation missions and also animal welfare. But I would like to highlight this relevance of the individual needs that you mentioned and how it is getting here in the context of zoos. Thank you so much. I am delighted now to introduce our next speaker, the brilliant Dr. Heather Browning. Dr. Browning is a postdoctoral research officer in animal sentience and welfare at the London School of Economics as part of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project. She completed her PhD at the Australian National University last year, and she previously worked for many years as a zookeeper and zoo animal welfare Officer. Her presentation title is Positive Welfare for Zoo Animals. And Dr. Browning, thank you so much for being here again, and you have our full attention.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for coming along today. So today I'm going to be talking about positive welfare for zoo animals. And it's great to see that in some of the talks already, some of these topics have already been covered as well. So one of the things I think that we get in this discourse when we're talking about the welfare of zoo animals and the interests of individuals versus the interests of species is that we do have this idea that we're trading off animal welfare for other goals. So we're thinking that, if we have conservation goals, we have education goals, we have to trade those off somehow against the individuals. And behind this, there's this sort of tacit assumption that captive animals must be harmed by doing this, that the reason there's a trade-off is because they are worse off by us having done these trade-offs. And that sort of assumes that they must have poor welfare. By contrast, if we take zoo animals to actually have good welfare, then we don't need to view this as a sacrifice. They're not making a sacrifice for these other goals. We can achieve one goal and achieve the other at the same time. So what I'm going to talk about today is thinking about what counts as good welfare. How is it that we decide when an animal has a good life or does not have a good life? And then also talk a little bit about what zoos are doing to ensure that animals do fall on the positive side of this line. So just to start with very briefly, what do I mean when I talk about welfare? I think that's really important to establish straight up. I think anyone who's writing about welfare or talking about welfare, they need to be clear about what sort of welfare concept they're using. For me, the most plausible concept is the feelings-based or the subjective experience account, where the welfare of an animal consists in the things that it feels, the things that it experiences. These are often known as affects. So it has hunger and thirst, the feeling of curiosity, the feeling of thermal comfort, feeling of comfort when it's resting, interaction with conspecifics, all these things that create positive or negative feelings, the balance of which is their welfare. And there are different accounts and different ways that we can think about welfare. So some of the common ones are physical functioning. So we might think about the health and the fitness of an animal. Natural living is a very common one that comes up when people are thinking about zoo animals in particular. It comes up a lot more, I think, for exotic animals than for domestic animals. And also for preference satisfaction, that, an animal has its preferences, it has the things that it wants. And I think all of these things are definitely important for animal welfare. Animals that are healthy, that are somehow, flourishing with many of their natural behaviors, that having their preferences satisfied are going to have better welfare. But I think that these are instrumentally important. So the reason that animals with these conditions have better welfare is because they create positive feelings. And in the cases where they don't have negative feelings about these things or positive feelings, they're not actually going to contribute to welfare beyond that. So I guess just keep in mind as I'm talking through here that this is this feelings-based account that we're thinking of. But I think a lot of the same things apply even if you were to hold a different account. So what is good welfare? We need to think about where we set our baseline. What are we comparing it to? What is good welfare? What is bad welfare? What's the line that we're comparing against? And I think there are three different possible lines that we can use here. There's a zero line, there's the line of the welfare of wild animals, and then there's sort of an upper line of optimal welfare. So to go in a little bit more detail, when we think of the zero line, we think here of the spectrum of welfare going from good to poor, with neutral welfare being a zero line in the middle, where the negatives and the positives kind of exactly balance each other out. And there's sort of a zero, it's neither good nor bad. So for an animal on this sort of condition to have good welfare, it just needs to be above that zero line by even a small amount. It needs to have more positive than negative experiences on balance, such that the amount of pleasure it experiences outweighs the amount of suffering it experiences. And this is a really common point that's used when people think about a life worth living. Often when euthanasia decisions are being made, it's the same idea that, is an animal's suffering outweighing its pleasure, or is the opposite true? And so in this case, we're just trying to think, what is the predominant kind of experience an animal's having? Now, the next balance is wild animal welfare. I think when we're talking about zoos, this is a very, very common baseline that people use. They think that for a zoo animal to have a good life, its welfare needs to be at least as good as its wild relatives. And so I think this probably comes from this idea that these animals are in some sense being denied the life that they could otherwise have had as a wild animal. And so to compensate for that, you want to make sure that their captive life is at least that good. And I've put a little note here saying there's this problem of non-identity. So in philosophy, the non-identity problem is this idea that when you're comparing what could have been for another animal, actually what you're thinking about is in this sort of other possible world, that animal would not have existed at all. You're actually thinking about some other animal that may have existed. So for almost all animals in zoos these days, they weren't actually taken from the wild, they were born in captivity. So there's no real sense in which a life in the wild was ever available for them. The only choices were really to exist or to not exist. We're not comparing them to the life they could have had, but there still seems to be some meaning in the idea that that's what we could consider a good life for an animal of that type. And so I've got this picture here. It's a little bit of a Garden of Eden view. Obviously, that's not quite what the wild is like. But when we do think about it, we then do have this empirical problem of trying to figure out what is the welfare level of wild animals. You know, it's not this Garden of Eden, like that picture in the last slide. And there's a huge amount of disagreement about whether the lives of wild animals are on balance very positive or even a little bit or very negative. And because we just really don't have enough data yet to really understand what the overall balance of experience is like for wild animals. You know, we know there are many negatives in their lives. There's predation, there's hunger, there's thirst, there's disease, there's exposure to elements and fires, all kinds of things that can create a lot of suffering for wild animals. And those are things that tend to be absent in captivity. But there are also positives available to wild animals too. And these, I think, are the focus of people, particularly who think that zoos don't do well to provide welfare for animals, is these behavioural freedoms and the opportunities that can be provided to wild animals that captive animals may lack. And so what's unclear is, on balance, how do we weigh these up to get kind of a total score for what the life of a wild animal is like? You know, it's got some negatives, it's got some positives, just as a captive animal does. On balance, do these create a better experience in the wild or in captivity? And there's a nice paper a few years ago from Jake Vesey, who's a zoo biologist, where he was thinking about this question about how you compare captive and wild. And so this graph here sort of shows that you've got your physical safeguards that captivity provides, you know, freedom from hunger and thirst and from these elements. But then you've got the psychological opportunities that are probably greater in the wild. And so where you've got these two things crossing over, there's probably going to be this level of peak welfare somewhere in the middle, or perhaps over to the side, where some degree of management of an animal actually probably is better for its welfare than being fully wild. So you might have something like, you know, a very extensively managed population that has veterinary intervention and, you know, food supplementation when times get bad, quite possibly a better life than just a pure wild animal. And so this idea that all wild animals have better lives than all captive animals, I think, is a very questionable one. And we need to think instead about what it is that animals in the wild and captivity have and don't have. And then the final baseline is this idea of optimal welfare. So, you know, the best possible welfare an animal can have. And clearly this is not achievable in practice. No animal, wild or captive, has optimal welfare. It's not as happy as it could possibly be. And so the problem with this baseline is there's no real way of distinguishing what's adequate and inadequate welfare. You know, if you say, well, look, no one's at the optimal, we've got degrees, some are close to it, some are further away from it. But how far away is too far away for an animal to have an acceptable quality of life? And that is a really difficult question to answer. So I think this is probably a good aspirational baseline because it may encourage best practice as we're trying to get closer and closer. But I think we need to think about where we set the line for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable as well. Because if the only thing that's acceptable is absolute optimal welfare, we're just going to find that almost nothing we do, and probably almost nothing in the wild, meets that either. So there are these different ways of judging, and they have different levels of demandingness. The higher we set our baseline, obviously, the more we're going to expect for an animal to be justified. And I think it's really important that we need to be clear what set point we're using, because in so much of this discussion, I just don't see that. When people are saying animals in zoos are badly off, or they're harmed, they're suffering, it's not clear what they mean relative to what. Do they mean that they have more suffering than pleasure? Do they mean they're worse than wild animals? And without having these set points, we don't really have a way of engaging with each other and understanding where each other are coming from. So then I guess the question here is, you know, even according to any of these baselines, can zoos provide positive welfare? And I think, you know, I'll go through here a few examples. I think the answer is definitely yes, at least, you know, in the ideal situations for many species. I think we'll find that there are lots of zoos that currently are not providing positive welfare for most of their animals. And there are perhaps some species for which their requirements are just too complex for zoos to provide. But I think in very, very many cases, zoos are going to be able to provide positive welfare for animals. And when we think about that, what this means is that we don't have to think of these animals as somehow being sacrificed for the goals of conservation. Their lives are good lives. They're animals that are doing perfectly well. They're perfectly happy where they are. And so perhaps we can have both things at once. So in terms of thinking about the ways in which zoos provide for positive welfare, there are welfare standards and accreditation that's basically, sort of spreading worldwide now. So this is the World Zoo and Aquarium Animal Welfare Strategy from several years ago from the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is essentially an industry body that spans the entire globe that looks to help regulate the ways that zoos are running and make sure that we're all meeting our duties towards our animals. And sort of following on from this, a lot of the regional zoo bodies now have accreditations that include animal welfare standards as well. So to become an accredited member of the European Association of Zoos, the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the Australasian Zoo and Aquarium Association, all these things require us to have these welfare accreditations. And when I was an animal welfare officer in Australia, this was one of the things that I did. And so the idea here is that someone comes and they essentially assess your collection alongside with you to ensure that your animals are receiving positive welfare. And this is done primarily through what's known as the 5 domains of welfare. It's very commonly used within the zoo welfare world now. And the idea here is you divide this welfare up into several domains. Here it looks like more because the behavioral domain's been subdivided. The idea is you have these physiological domains of nutrition, of the living environment. So that's the temperature and the surfaces, the noise levels, and the health and fitness. So, how sick or healthy this animal might be. And then this behavioral domain, all the different opportunities and frustrations it might have. And then we feed all these down into this 5th domain of mental state. So as we're assessing our animals, we're thinking, say we're looking at the nutrition domain and we say, does an animal have adequate access to food? But we're assessing this relative to its mental state. So we think, okay, an animal that doesn't have enough food is going to feel hungry or it's going to feel frustrated. And so it's not just about having sufficient access to food, it's having enough food to feel satiated. So say a lot of high concentrated pelleted diets for animals provide all their nutrients very, very quickly. And these animals then don't ever feel full. And so that's a negative for them. We want to make sure that they have full bellies because that's a nice feeling. We want to make sure they have a variety of foods available that can give them the kinds of taste pleasures that they want. And so we're always thinking about all of these things. Thinking about how is it that makes the animal feel. And then when we're assessing their welfare, at least within the Australian program, the idea is within all these domains, you have to have none of them with a negative score and at least one with a positive score. So this is sort of our 0 baseline, the idea that an animal must have more positives than no negatives. And that's what's required in order to pass your accreditation. So this is people thinking very strongly about the ways that animals have positive lives within their zoos. And, a huge part of the operating budget of the zoo goes towards the keeping staff whose entire daily job is to ensure that these things are going well for animals. Zoo animal welfare science is just booming. We've got all these books on zoo animal welfare and zoo ethics, and we've got animal welfare science officers, science departments within so many different zoos now. So we've got, centres for zoo welfare. We've got welfare monitoring programs coming out. We've got seminars. We're disseminating this animal welfare information, and disseminating it to the public as well. And so welfare is just a huge part of a zoo operation. And really this idea of trying to be leaders in the science of animal welfare and know what our animals want and how to give them good lives is a really important part of zoo operations. And the agency, choice and control, just to finish up, this is something that's come up in some of the other talks, this is the one thing that perhaps we're thinking is the most lacking when we come up with zoo animals, that we know they have all these protections, but what they don't have is these agency and choices. And so there are a number of ways now that we're trying to make animals have this within zoos. So, we give them complex exhibits so they can decide, are you in the sun or the shade? Are you up high or down low? Are you on display or off display? Are you in a shelter? Are you out of a shelter? In the rain, out of the rain? And they can make all these choices about their own microclimates and what they want to be doing. Overhead walkways, I think a lot of zoos are bringing in these sorts of things now. These are wonderful. They allow the animals to get out of their enclosures and travel around large parts of the zoos. Often you can share them between different species, as in, the tigers have them at one point, the monkeys have them at another point during the day. And then you can get all these kinds of animals just exploring much larger parts of their environment. Digital technologies. So there's very cool things now giving animals the choice to interact with these sort of cognitively stimulating games. sensor operated showers, which you can do motion activated for elephants, tortoises. I've seen them for emus as well. Again, using these digital technologies to allow animals to activate what they want. Some very cool research recently on giving these Saki monkeys the ability to activate visual or audio enrichment by going into a little box, and the sensor then plays them a sound or shows them a video, and they can decide whether or not they want to see that and how often. And all these things are just ways of giving them choice and control and this agency with their own environment, which is the part of welfare that's perhaps been lacking the most in the past, but one that zoos are really focusing on now to give their animals this positive experience. So to finish up, I think zoos are absolutely capable of providing animals with positive welfare, at least in most cases. Like I said, there may be exceptions to this with particular species or particular environments, and we need to be mindful of that and make better choices of who we're keeping. But if this is true, then there's not a necessary trade-off between individuals and species interests. We can have our conservation programs with perfectly happy animals as well. And I guess that means that everyone is doing well there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Browning, for your insights. I'm pretty sure that they have captured the attention of the audience, and I think that we have some questions already regarding your presentation, so thank you so much. I will now turn to our fourth and last speaker, Dr. Véronique Servet. It is a great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Servet. Thank you again for accepting our invitation. Véronique has a master's in psychology and a PhD in anthropology. She has studied human-animal interactions in zoos and trained dolphins' affective relationships in a marine park. She's currently engaged in ethnographic studies of the experience of meeting animals and nature, with a focus on the creative and changing potential of these experiences. She teaches at the University of Liège in Belgium. And Dr. Servet, you may share the screen now, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a specialist of the animals themselves, and I'm going to talk about the perception of the animals as subjects in the zoo. So when I'm addressing this question, maybe first we should say that I think that two questions must be distinguished. The first one is, the zoo animals themselves, are they subjects? I mean, are they the subjects of their life or the authors of their life? It is about their ability to be subjects and the authors of their life. One question that can be interesting is do their actions make any difference? I mean, what they do, they behave, does it make any difference to what happens to them? And this is being a subject in a biological or very ecological, very, very large sense, broad sense, I mean. And the other question is about the visitors of the zoo, and I've been mainly interested in them. This is about the ability for the zoo visitors to perceive the animals as subjects against objects. And this is a much complex, a different situation. Maybe to introduce this, I would like to take just a very simple example, the example of whale watching. We can go to whale watching and see whales. And of course, you have whales that are subjects in their own environment, that they live their own life, they are free, okay. They are in an ecologically sound environment. But it's not not necessary that the people who go and see them are going to see the whales as subjects. And it depends on the whole environment, of the way that they are taken to the whales, the story that is told to them. And all this is very important in the way they are going to perceive the whale. I was recently in a whale watch, and this is why I take this example. And most of the people were mainly there, I mean, to to get a nice picture of this kind of picture. And in this situation, I had the impression that very, very few of the people on the boat did really consider the whales as subjects. So I'm going to detail this. But first, let's talk a little bit about the ecological selves of the animals themselves. I know that many have already been said about that, so I'm going to be very quick. So if we look at the zoo from a very distant point of view, I mean, as an anthropologist, we look at this special human activity of keeping captive animals in zoo. We see that one living species has the power and the desire to keep other species in captivity or under its care. And this is done for pleasure, for scientific interest, for interest of an abstract entity called the species or biodiversity, for many different reasons. But of course, the captive animals themselves, and they cannot do anything about this situation. They're just the object of something that has nothing to do with them, which is a human activity. So the logic that governs their life is completely disconnected from their own actions. And in this sense, of course, they are mostly objects. If we take if we look at the situation at the scale of the zoo, and I know that of course zoos are changing, doing a lot to manage to the situation, to make it better, but at the scale of the zoo, we must say that the life of the animals are mostly decided by the keepers, I mean, or the zoo managers, or even sometimes more distant concern of competition between zoo. I want to have this kind of animals because that zoo has this, or expected profits, or genetic diversity management, etc. So the animals are moved, they are introduced into groups, they are removed from these groups, they are mated, euthanized, fed in such and such way. So they don't, in this sense also, as have just been said, they don't really act on their life. So they don't have, and they don't have control over their environment. The actions don't have any consequences on their world. With the exceptions, of course, of the sometimes of the social interactions, but it's partial because the animals are taken from one group and put in another one, and that, well, in this situation, this is also
Excuse
yes?
me, Veronique. So sorry for interrupting you.
Yes.
I think that these slides are not working. We are watching just one slide. I wait a little bit just to see if it worked,
okay.
But it didn't. Maybe you could stop sharing the screen and then doing it again.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries at all, please.
Okay.
And if it still doesn't work, I have your slides and maybe I can share it.
Let's try it.
Okay. Oh, now they are working. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it seems to work.
Okay, sorry for that, but please interrupt me if it happens again, because I don't know why it happened.
It's okay. It's totally fine. Yeah,
okay.
We were listening to you. It was really
okay,
but we didn't see these slides.
Okay, sorry. So what I was saying, that when you look at the situation, the scale of the zoo, well, the animals, they don't have control over their environment either. Their actions don't have any consequence, or very partial consequences on their own world, in a world in which they live. They behave, but the environment does not react to them, to their behavior. So in a way, we can say that they don't live in they don't have a meaningful relationship with their environment. So I'm going to, is it okay? Do you see the slide, next slide?
Perfect.
Yes.
Veronique, thank you. Yeah.
So when we reduce the scale again and look at the animal as a living organism, looking at the individual animal, things are a little bit different, because of course an individual animal will always try to make sense of his or her world and to adapt to it, whatever it is, even the barest one. And of course today, enrichments of the cages give the captive animal a milieu on which they can act, and that partially reacts to them. So we have the beginning of meaningful relationship between the animal and his or her environment. Their environment is partly alive towards them, we could say. So there is an opportunity for them to be the subjects of a small and limited world, but still. Okay, so but as we have said, as we have seen with the example of the whale, does it mean that the visitors of the people, does it mean that they will see the animals as subjects, or only maybe as objects? And in order to answer that question, we need to go and look at what the visitors in the zoo do. And to follow them, so to do some ethnographic work of the zoo visit. But maybe first we could say that what is necessary for an animal to be perceived as a subject. And I think that one animal can be perceived as a subject when he's perceived as a subject of a world or a subject in a world. I mean, we know that the definition of the animal subject in an animal is a subject that who builds his or her world, who acts in this world and is acted upon by the world according to one's own actions. So this could be broad definition of a subject, animal or human. So to be able to perceive an animal as a subject, it is necessary to be able to perceive at the same time the animal and the world that he or she constructs, in which he or she lives, what we call the Umwelt. This is the world to which the animal is sensitive, the world that he enacts as a subject, in which he lives or she lives, that the environment that matters to him or to her, which is, of course, it's not the same as the human environment. So, of course, when the animal have no impact or a very reduced one on their own life, when their environment is not carved by them, but for them and for the visitor's comfort by the zoo, then it is difficult for the visitor to perceive animals as subjects, as authors in their environment. But as we have seen, we have no much efforts that are done by the zoos to enrich the cages of the animal, to offer them choices, and also to put the animals in a more wildlife scenery. I mean, to propose wildlife scenes that give the visitors the illusion that the enclosures are pieces of nature where the animals live their life. But again, the question, can the animal be perceived as subject or only as animal object put in a nice setting, which could be also the case. So as I said previously, when we talk about the perception of visitors or the pedagogical role of zoos, it is important to go and see what visitors do, what they say, what they look at, etc. What are the expectancies? What is the experience of the animals and of the zoo visit? And we can ask question, what is a visit to the zoo? Is it about learning about animals? Is it about socializing with friends or family? Is it about having fun? Is it about being with animals? All this can be true. So another way of asking the question is, what happens in a zoo visit for the visitors? How do the animals appear to them? How do they make sense to them? Because I think that the question is, how can the visitors can make sense of the animals that they see? And it's not an easy question, indeed. So in order to answer that question, you have to look at it from a sociological and anthropological point of view. As an anthropologist, I'm mainly interested in the patterns or structure, or we could say the device, which connects human beings, the visitors, and zoo animals. And this larger pattern, explains or shapes the way visitors see the animals, how they perceive them, what they remember of their zoo visit, what their expectancies, etc., etc. So this pattern is both sociological. The zoo visit is a specific social situation. It is a social occasion. It's entertainment. So it has meaning in a social, sociologically, in a social, as a social situation. And it's also anthropological. I mean, you have the cultural history of the zoo, the education of the affects, the education of the sensibilities towards animal, etc., etc. So when people go to the zoo, all this is, thank you, all this is there, is already there. And the experience of the visitor is framed and patterned by many layers of meaning. This I already say. Though, so what can we see when you look at the visitors in a zoo? Well, this is really a very, very summary. We see that visitors, they want to see the animals. It is expected that animals show themselves as they are usually depicted or typically represented. I mean, the lion must do the lion, the monkey must do the monkey. Very often they compare the zoo with other entertainment parks, for example, Disney. They mostly refer to popular culture to contextualize what they see. They talk about Disney, about movies, etc. And what is, I think, is interesting is that they are aware that the animals are not real animals that live a free life. They often talk about not real animals. Oh, I see this animal, but I've seen a real one over there in the nature. So we could say that to the visitors, the animals have very ambiguous status. It is both close and distant. It is close, real, and somehow unreal. And of course, we also have visitors that develop a friendship with animals. So going to the conclusion, I would like to say that two different points must be distinguished when we are thinking about animals as subjects in the zoo. First, the opportunity for the animals to be the authors of his or her life, and then the opportunity for the visitors to perceive the animals as subjects. The first one depends mainly on the management of the zoo, and the second one depends mainly on the pattern which connects the visitors and the animals. And this pattern is of course very complex, and sociological and anthropological is the larger cultural and social context, the story told by the zoo, how the visitors are taken to see the animals. But in any case, given the animals are captive animals, and given that the status of the zoo is an entertainment place, animals that manage to behave as subjects could nevertheless be perceived as false animals or not be taken seriously by the visitors. Thank you very much. So I'm going now to stop the sharing of my screen.
Thank you so much, Véronique Serpet. Thank you so much. It was really enlightening. Unfortunately, we have little time for each speaker. It's a shame because it was really interesting. And it has been a pleasure to listen to you all. And we will now open the floor for discussion, as we are running out of time and we won't be able, I think, to answer all the questions that we wish to, but we still can select some of the questions in the remaining time. I've gathered them together in a message, so I'm going to write it down in the Zoom chat. Let me copy and paste, and so you can read them all just in one message. Here you have the questions from the audience so far. I have a few questions more, but if we have time. So the first one, I think, is not directed to any speaker specifically. It says, in this new digital world, why it's not possible to observe and learn virtually rather than be a captivity and compromising individual rights? Really interesting point here. I don't know if any of the speakers would like to jump in first.
I can say something briefly on this, and if anyone else wants to.
Thank you, Dr. Browning. Thank you. Yeah.
So I guess there'd be two things I want to say. First, following on from what I talked about, I don't necessarily think that we have to think that having captivity is a compromise of the individual rights of the animals. I think it is entirely possible to have a zoo where the animals are happy and people are seeing them at the same time. So I think thinking of this as a dichotomy is perhaps not always the best way to kind of envision it. But the second thing is just that, there are some studies on this, on the role of digital learning as compared to in-person experiences. And it does seem like, at least when you can get up close and really get to know an animal, there is a lot more impact in having the real world experience as compared to the virtual experience. There are even cases where someone watched a video of a training session of someone who's with a polar bear as compared to standing with the keeper and watching it in person. The retention of changes in attitudes and knowledge about those animals was much higher being in person than just watching the video. And for that reason, I think there is still this important role of the in-person experience.
Thank you,
May
Dr.
I
Browning.
add something? Oh,
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yes, I think that being the presence of the body of the animal makes a big difference, and because we are perceiving them not only with our mind but also with our body, and it makes a huge difference, I think.
I can add something too. Yeah, I also agree that I think the direct connection or like presence of the animal makes a big difference. I also do think that captivity might not necessarily compromise individual rights. I mean, there are different rights theories concerning animals, and you have the one that's typical of like Francione or Tom Reagan, that talks about the abolitionist type of rights that I talked about in my presentation. But I think you can also take like Cochrane's theory of rights, where he talks about rights being related to interests. So if animal interests are well provided for in captivity and interests are equal to rights, then I think you could have, you could think of captivity not necessarily compromising individual rights. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne-Claire. Thank you so much for your reflections on this point. Dr. Roman, I don't know if you would like to add something about this point, or...
I agree with what other speakers have said, and I think the contact and the behavioral from both from humans and from animals, when you are face to face with animals, change the emotion and the feelings that you can have. And I think it's important for people to have this possibility to observe animals and to discover them, but if they are in good condition in captivity, as and highlighted by others.
Thank you, Dr. Roman, for your insights. The second one is directed to Dr. Browning, and it's related with accreditation and welfare. Do you think accreditation bodies do enough to guarantee animal welfare, their members' zoos?
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good question and a very important one. I certainly don't want to speak for a global context here, because I'm not really certain, the intricacies of what the accreditation processes are like everywhere around the world. But, I certainly think that they're moving in the right direction. So, accreditation not only gets zoos to be somewhat accountable for their animals, but it changes the interorganizational thinking about how they perceive animal welfare. So, just talking from my own experience, I know the Australasian welfare accreditation process is quite rigorous. And like I said, it looks at this zero baseline. The idea is that you have to sort of demonstrate that the animals are being assessed have an overall positive and net positive state of welfare. But then you start thinking that way about all the animals in your collection and about the ways in which you're looking after them and the sort of things that you're providing for them. So even in the cases where the accreditation itself hasn't specifically looked at something, the keepers have now got this added awareness of the way that they're managing their animals, and management has, an awareness of the way that we're housing them. That shifts things. So I certainly wouldn't think that we could rely entirely on accreditation to guarantee that we're going to have good welfare everywhere, because there's always ways to game the system if people want to. But I think having accreditation there and changing the organizational thinking, both at the level of the individual zoo and the kind of global and regional zoo bodies, is definitely what's going to help us move in that direction. And that, for the most part, we can think that accredited zoos are going to be ones that have positive animal welfare. So, there's this idea that if you want to visit somewhere and you want to feel, I guess, safer about the idea that you're going somewhere that's working ethically, that accreditation is a good way for consumers to decide that they're supporting the right kinds of zoos.
Thank you, Dr. Browning. We have a third question here. Nikita Dawan, apologies if I didn't pronounce it properly, is directed to Dr. Browning, but maybe we could hear, I would love to hear the other speakers about this point. The question is the following. You mentioned that for animals born in captivity, you cannot really compare with life in the wild, they never had it to begin with. However, if we think the same scenario for humans, can we really apply the same thinking? For example, children born in captivity don't really need a free life? That's a really hard question.
Yeah, good. So, I mean, one thing I do want to make clear, I didn't want to say that I think that comparison to wild animal lives is the wrong baseline to use. I think what I was trying to say is that the justification for why we use it can't be something to do with the fact that this animal would otherwise have lived that life, because it wouldn't have. But if we want to come up with a different justification for why we think the wild animal welfare is still the right baseline, such that living a wildlife is the only way for an animal to feel happy, or, somehow as a member of a particular species, there is some kind of right for it to have that kind of life, I think that's fine. We just need to be clear of what we're justifying here, and we can't use that justification. So in the case of children, one of the reasons that freedom is so important to humans is because we have this strong sense of autonomy. Humans notoriously feel terrible when they're being controlled and feel very good when they're exercising agency. And it seems like that's true for a lot of animals. And so, there the justification is we're thinking about what feels good or bad for the animal rather than very specifically about what's happening elsewhere. And so I guess, my main point was just to be very clear about what our comparisons are and why we're making them, rather than saying anything particularly about the wild versus captivity.
Thank you, Dr. Browning. If any other speaker would like to add something about this point, about this reflection that Nikita Dawan pointed out?
Yeah, just quickly, I think one important thing is also, as I said about wild animals, we should not forget that they are mainly living for their survival, and the question of welfare for wild animals is maybe less relevant, because the first thing that wild animals are doing is try to survive and adapt to their environment. So I think it was also one important point of the presentation from Heather.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. We have a fourth question here. Gabriela Timowski-Jonet, again, apologies if I didn't pronounce it well, asks, what is the future of zoos? Maybe we could leave that question for closing the discussion part, and I will ask you just 2 or 3 sentences about this question. I hope, Gabriela, it's okay to you. And then we have a question in Spanish. Thank you, Ana Cristina Ramirez, for your question. She says, congratulations for the extraordinary event. Apologies for the translation. I'm going to do it while I read. I would like to know your ideas, your reflections on the animal welfare of captive predators. It's an important aspect of their natural behavior. It's an important aspect of their natural behavior being mutilated or being not paying attention by the zoological administration. Which one are the ethical dilemmas that are confronting the zoos, and what's going on about the future within this point related with natural behavior and captive predators? Should anyone would like to add something about this point?
Yeah, I can say something if no one else has something to say. I think when we're thinking about the natural behaviors, we need to think about what the relevant components of those natural behaviors are. So, I mean, it does obviously seem true that for predators, pretty much all the time, the experience of hunting and stalking, of pouncing, of processing prey items are probably all sources of positive welfare experience for them. But whether or not that needs to occur in the context of actually capturing and killing an animal is a very different thing. And so, it at least seems like, and zoos do try and do this, to break down the different components of this and give these animals chances to stalk, chances to pounce, chances to rip apart carcasses. You can carcass feed animals that have obviously already been killed. And the idea that all these natural behaviors are still going to be available to these animals, even if they're not actually hunting in the sort of traditional sense.
Yeah, just to add something, I think most of the zoo, or at least for carnivores, it would be important for animals to really try to keep to give them the opportunity to have these patterns of hunting, even if it's not with a live prey. And also some zoos develop enrichment to also make carnivores experience failures of hunting with zip line, for instance, with food, and so they have to hunt, and it's not they do not have always access to food, and I think it's something really important to maintain the behavioral diversity. And we can also ask the same question for the prey animals. So maybe should we consider that they are, they have good welfare just because they are in zoos and just because they have not predators? So it's a complex question for every species, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roman. I don't know if Dr. Véronique Servet would like to add something about the natural behavior of captive predators and how zoological institutions and administrations are dealing with this issue of their natural behavior, or maybe Anne Clay would like to add something about this point.
I think, well, for me, I think Amelie and Heather addressed it pretty well. It's also something that I wonder about, I mean, when you talk about having carnivores in zoos and they're not expressing their natural predatory behavior as freely as another member of their species would in the wild, in Amelie's presentation referred to needing to keep behaviors in the necessity of keeping natural behaviors in zoos. And yeah, so I've also wondered about that question, if eventually, like since these animals are not practicing their natural hunting behaviors in the captivity, like they eventually might lose that behavior. So it's also something that I've like wondered about. And then I think like culturally too, when it comes to carcass feeding, for example, like in some, like I think in some zoos in the United States, like it wouldn't be acceptable to present a full carcass in front of the public, but in other zoos, like in Europe, it's a little bit more acceptable. So I think there's also these like cultural issues when it comes to these things as well.
Thank you very much, Anne, for your answer. We have another question here. Silvia Corte Cortazo asks and draws our attention to the following fact. Even among scientists, consideration of the individual and his welfare is not always a priority. How and from where do you think we should have an impact so that these concepts and actions are disseminated and promoted? I think it's directed to the four speakers.
I might start to reply. It's a very good point. Indeed, it might be difficult to say that welfare have to be a priority, and for me, it's to start with all staff that work at the zoo. To be clear that animal welfare is not just the responsibility of the veterinarian or of the zookeepers or the director. It's all the staff that will have an impact of animals, even an impact of the ways that they will behave directly with them, but also with the decisions that are made and the choices of the species presented, or the management of the groups. And I think we always have to remind to everyone that animals should be always first in our consideration, that we can be all the voices for the animals, but we have to do not forget that we are working with animals and for animals. And I think everyone should be concerned by this.
Thank you very much, Amelie. Do we have any other reflection on this question? So we could jump into the next one. Marcia Condoy asks the following: do you believe that zoos are important for creating empathy or connection in people with the animals? I consider zoos a bad condition to animals, but maybe zoos are the only contact that many people have with wild animals. I think this is connected with our last event with Laurie Wren last Wednesday about entangled empathy. I think that it's really interesting. Maybe you could say a few words about the relevance of empathy and what's the work here regarding zoos in creating empathy.
So may I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, I think that the direct contact with the animal can create a very strong emotion, and sometimes kind of aesthetic emotion. I mean, something that goes very, very deeply, and many of us, I think, have already experienced it. but the question for me is then what do we do with this emotion? And it's really an important question, because you can just sell the experience of meeting the animal as a zoo. I mean, it can be a kind of product, and then, well, you have that emotion and then another one, and then you go from one attraction to the other one, like in a entertainment park. Or you can offer the opportunity to reflect on that emotion and see what is there in it. And I think it's a very important emotion that we can have contacting animals. But then you need to have time and to contact your own body and to think about that, and maybe to be accompanied, maybe, and create a completely different experience. And then the meaning of the emotion and the meaning of the animal and the encounter that you have with the animal is completely different. But as I tried to say, it really depends on the whole context of the encounter. And the emotion is there, but it can make a kind of just a product to be sold, or something very precious that matters to the people, and that can be a motivation for conservation, for doing something. But it really depends on what we do with that emotion.
Thank you so much, Veronique. And Clay, maybe you would like to add something. I saw that you put your micro, you turn on your micro.
Yeah, I would like to jump in on that. So I think that zoos have potential to be, I think they do create connections or empathy, but I think they have a potential to do more in that direction, because, like, as Veronique said, these animals are viewed mostly as like objects, and then the zoo, I feel like, presents these animals in an environment which is like an illusion of what we consider nature, like our perception of nature. And there's not really any opportunity for like, we are gazing at the animal, but there's not really much opportunity for the animal to gaze back at us. So to me, I think that maybe, and this might also overlap with the answer to the question of what the future of zoos is, but I feel like if we have zoos play more of a sanctuary or refuge role, where you have animals that you connect with the public, but who are also maybe like affected by human actions. It could be a way for people to get educated by seeing these animals and thinking, well, this animal has been harmed because of human action. So I feel like there should be a transformation of the zoo more in that type of direction, to create more of a connection of empathy. So that's my response to that.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it's a really difficult and complex issue. And as I said after your presentation, it's a representation itself of a historical debate, at least, that we are dealing with in applied ethics between alleged incompatible perspectives. So yeah, it's a really complex issue. Thank you so much for your answer, and I think that we are running out of time right now. We unfortunately, I would love to stay longer, but at least here in Spain it's 2:30 already. So maybe, Anne, if you would like to just add a few. Oh, we have the last question. What is the future of zoos? Just a few sentences, please, for each speaker. I would love to hear them. Just 1 or 2 sentences. What do you think about about that.
I will start. I have from what I see and people with who I'm working now, I think that those are making real efforts about animal welfare, and there is real changing in staff consideration about that. So I think animal welfare will be more a priority in the next years, also because the society, I think, expect more also about it now. And for me, yeah, the communication with general audience would be a key point for those to continue to conduct their missions. So.
Thank you, Dr. Roman.
Would I say something?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really don't know what the future of the zoo is, but my concern is that there is a tendency to make the whole natural world a big zoo. And well, this is something a little bit different, but what I mean is that a place where animals are controlled, where we can go and see them when we want, and well, this kind of making nature a spectacle for human being. So, well, that's another point, a little bit different, but that's, yes, what I see.
Thank you, Dr. Servet. Maybe Dr. Browning would like to say something else, and then Anne-Clay, I give you the floor to just conclude, and also your thought about this question.
Yeah, so the future of zoos, I think, it tracks what others have been saying here, is this idea that we're just going to continue this focus on the welfare of animals, but very particularly with this idea of agency, this enabling the agency and the control that animals can have over their environment, so that these habitats that we're holding them in, replicate all these experiences that are probably very, very important for their welfare, these behavioral opportunities. And also on the other side, increasing the effectiveness of the connections we're making between the humans and the wildlife. There's a lot of science now on exactly how effective what zoos are doing, and which areas of these interactions with the public are working best and how we can improve them. And so I think we're going to find that the ways that we can sort of build this empathy and mobilize it into something that's important for wildlife is going to increase in effectiveness.
Thank you, Dr. Browning.
Okay, yeah, thank you for all those insightful comments. I'll just answer the last question. So I think, like, the way I see how welfare is developing in zoos, I mean, earlier the animal's Umwelt was mentioned, which is like the perspective that the animal has of the world or the environment around him. And I think that animal welfare in zoos is trying to perceive that Umwelt, and that the animal experience, the animal interest. So I feel like the future of zoos will probably go in that direction, as Heather mentioned, that there will be more. There seems to be more focus on giving animals more autonomy and control. But I also think that my interviews, like my last quotation, showed that in an ideal world, there's this belief that zoos, like right now, we don't live in an ideal world. So we need zoos to educate people about environmental problems. So I think we should work to move towards that ideal world and have animals not be in zoos eventually, sometime in the distant future. we are out of time now, unfortunately. It's a very fascinating subject, and I wish we could talk. I could talk for hours about it, so I wish we could talk about it more, but there will definitely be more events like this in the future. This concludes our roundtable on addressing individual animal interests within the zoo context. Again, we would like to thank Dr. Amelie Roman, Dr. Heather Browning, and Dr. Véronique Servet for joining us today and answering all these relevant questions that our audience has posed on zoos. Especially a big thank you to Pablo as well for being such a wonderful co-moderator. To our audience, we hope you found the topic stimulating and engaging. We hope these talks help you think deeply about the experiences of those you observe when you visit the zoological park, as well as the efforts that modern zoos do, not only for conservation, but for the positive mental and physical well-being of the animals they care for. Please feel free to share the YouTube replay of this roundtable to expand the conversation with those around you. And we encourage you to apply for membership with the Global Research Network if you are interested in being involved in future events on similar topics. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, and congratulations. It was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Bye.